and want to just again offer a warm welcome, abundantly warm. As you know, those of us who have met before in person and virtually know that the forums for Prenatal to 3 policy are the responsibility and the genesis of Elders for Infants, Representative Dave Pinto, Senator Jerry Ralph, and of course the University of St. Thomas and St. Catherine. And we've been just extremely grateful for the support from University of St. Thomas and St. Kate's. And I want you all to know there's a team of people working behind the scenes to gather us today. And we want to thank everyone. So for now, we're just going to give ourselves a few minutes just to get together and gathered. And I hope that you will all be able to hear well and connect well, and to know that we've been doing the forums now for the last 4 years. We began in June of 2016, and the goal actually of the Prenatal to 3 forums is threefold. One is to share plans, 2, establish a common base of knowledge, and 3, to build relationships. And each forum consists of a single theme related to Prenatal to 3. So we'll be getting into that in just a few minutes. But again, just wanting to welcome everyone. We're going to have a rather tight schedule today, so at 9:05 we will, as they say, begin. I think the registration right now is looking like I think we have maybe a couple of hundred registrants, and we're getting close to 100 right now in terms of people signing on, but this all just takes just a few minutes to happen. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the forum is really aimed to bring people, so this morning we're going to have a specific topic, which I'll be just introducing in a moment. And that will be the first half of the morning, first half of the webinar. And then the second half of the webinar, we'll be getting perspectives from 3 representatives of people doing statewide work. We'll be hearing from Deb Fitzpatrick, from Aaron Bailey, and from Tracy Roloff. And their work will be about the summary from the legislative session, the work of the Children's Cabinet, and the Preschool Development Grant. And there'll be time at the end of that for questions and answers. So the urgency and the potential of this moment in history brought us to a topic that has been a deep concern of Elders for Infants and others in our group, namely fathers and their role, their visibility, and their ability to be present during the earliest moments of development and the first 1,000 days. And pregnancy and birth, as we know, are easily understood as the domain of mothers and their babies, and fathers not so much. So this morning, we're going to be hearing from 2 African-American men who have been working in this field of fathers and fatherhood, and in general, in community healing from trauma. So I want to ask you to be willing today to lean in, to be willing to be uncomfortable, and to listen with an open heart. Dave Ellis is a member of Elders for Infants, and so he's been a longtime colleague. And we are going to turn the agenda over to him and to Charles. And we're going to be taking a little bit of an experimental path this morning, and we want you to just trust us. This is speaking as an elder who is not very Zoom friendly, but I'm learning that this is going to be a kind of a neat opportunity. So you'll be receiving instructions when the time comes. So I want to thank you all and know that we're going to get started now, and certainly there'll be some people joining us, but we'll get underway. So thank you and welcome Dave Ellis and Charles Dixon.
So I'm coming to you from my new digs here in Somerset, New Jersey. And while you can't see it, just know that I am enjoying myself finally having a place to put my computer that looks more like a desk, since we don't have even a table here. But I wanted to get started this morning. Jane talked about us going in a little bit different direction, and this conversation about fathers. Typically, we don't have this conversation, and given the light of where we are right now, I think that this becomes something that's very important for us to have a conversation about. And you see my very first slide says trigger warning on it. The reason I put that up there is that some of the things that we're going to talk about during these next few minutes could have an impact on somebody. And I don't want that to come as a surprise. Most of you who know me know that most of my work is around trauma. And so I like to let people know right from the beginning. In the world that I live in, when people are not uncomfortable, it creates problems for other people. And in that instance, for Black men, it means dying in lots of cases. And so I want us to approach this with the seriousness that there is. So this is the framing that Charles Dixon and I have come up with here. We talk about parenting, prenatal to 3, and racism. You know, there's that R word, which always tends to throw people. And looking at that through the lens of fathers, and specifically African-American fathers. Some of you may be familiar with comedian Dick Gregory. I grew up listening to Dick Gregory. Passed away in 2017. Civil rights activist, critic, writer, and a jokester from all levels. But Dick Gregory said, in the South, you can be close, just don't get too big. In the North, you can get big, just don't get too close. And he's specifically referencing African Americans and African American men specifically. And growing up in Southern Illinois and moving to Minnesota, this quote became very indicative. And so what you're going to see are a series of quotes as Charles and I are talking about fathers and their relationship in this thing called a family. Children do not exist outside the context of family. Therefore, fathers need to be included in that conversation. When we think about how we engage and how we see the world, a woman named Anais Nin had a saying that says, we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. And in that conversation, what she is getting at is the number of lenses that we begin to develop from childhood on up, because our children are not born with the biases. They develop those over time and they learn those over time. And so if we want to stop these things, we need to stop teaching some things. Fathers, I have to change my aspect so that I can actually see what's going on here. Every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it gives. I keep hearing people talk to me about systems being broken. I honestly do not believe that our systems are broken. I believe our systems are uniquely designed to give us the outcomes that they give us, and we simply don't like the outcomes. And with fathers, as you stop to think about the history of what fathers has been like and their interaction with families, you begin to see how some of those things begin to play out. And so what I'm going to do at this point in time is I'm going to ask Charles if he would, to step in and talk some about the history of what it's been like being an African American father in this day and time. Charles?
Good morning. Thank you, sir. When we speak about fathering uh, in the context of the United States of America, a look at history would illuminate some things for us and answer some questions we have. One specific question of why things look the way they do and why can't certain fathers get it together, or why are they deadbeats? Why do these people not want to be around their children? Let me take you through a small journey. The institution of slavery, um, the residue has not left. It's something that still has not been addressed. When you have a institution set up and families are systematically fractured, when you have breeding farms and you have a man taken from place to place for a number of days, weeks, months, and forced to rape and breed with women, how is he supposed to have a connection to those children in addition to that mental disconnect that he has to have for his own mental health? When he returns to his home plantation, his wife, who she chose him and he chose her willingly, now she's pregnant by their so-called master. So he's in a position where he has to raise a child that's not his and not be around children that are biologically his. If epigenetics is true and things can be passed via DNA, sometimes the disconnect you see has a historical relevance and is current, meaning some of us didn't necessarily know how to be effective fathers, so we end up parenting the way we were parented. Some of us that had functional fathers in terms of being producers or providers, that simply meant working and coming home. That didn't necessarily mean teaching me the things that I needed to know to be sensitive to women's needs, respectful to children, etc. I come from Southern Illinois also, East St. Louis, Illinois, and it's really rural, and overt racism is different than covert racism or Minnesota nice. You know, you have sundown towns where I'm from where it's spoken and written that people like myself shouldn't be caught there after dark. These things still exist. You can go into a search engine and type it in and you can see that it's not past, it's not history, it's current events. So when we speak about fathers, who's been allowed to be fathers? It's not that all fathers don't face issues. But when you look at certain communities, the Aboriginals or indigenous folks, for example, the institution of boarding schools destroyed their parenting systems all around. So when we look at the dysfunction that their community face right now, there is an explanation for it. And it's not necessarily the decision making of the people. Um, when we're feared, we're a threat. If we're articulate, if we're silent, it's a problem if a father asks questions, tries to assert himself and or be helpful. If we're constantly seen as a threat, that doesn't invite positive interaction. um, Institutions have continued after slavery, and we could call it Section 8, um, the work of social workers, and traditionally how things have turned out in my community, meaning the fracturing of the household, alienating family in terms of mother and child is family and father is expendable. That's not true in all communities, but it is in my community. And if we plan to be honest with ourselves first, then we need to deal with that history. And how we can deal with it is change how we do things from day to day. Let's acknowledge fathers as parents. Let's acknowledge fathers, mothers, and children as family. If not in a traditional nuclear setting, let the community define what family is, honor that, and treat folks the way we would want to be treated in terms of empathy and compassion. To discredit history or ignore it would be as disrespectful as not acknowledging the Holocaust for a Jewish community, not acknowledging the turmoil that the Irish had to go through when they got here. For example, having to take the O from their first name or the Mick from their first name to blend in and fit in because they were heavily discriminated against prior to us being emancipated. We need to embrace U.S. history, understand different vantage points, and then I think we can be more inclusive of fathers. Not all fathers are deadbeats. Some fathers are unable to participate. There's reasons for that. And not justifying deadbeats because I don't support that notion. I do support empowering families to be one, not isolating, and breaking down stereotypes that fathers, specifically so-called Black fathers, aren't engaged. There are reports that show that we are engaged. There's data that shows in the 1960s, so-called Black families were married at astronomical rates compared to today. Given those two facts, juxtapose that to we're basically still in the same position we were. You pick a 10-year span in the life of this country, 1776. And the deal is we have to be honest with ourselves about the history of where we come from. Sankofa is a term. It's a bird. You know, you can't really necessarily know where you're going without knowing your past. We have to stop ignoring the past, acknowledge it, and if we're truly uncomfortable with it, do something different.
Thanks, Charles. We've got about 7 minutes left, Charles and I, before we're going to do something, and Jane said this was going to be a little bit different, that we were going to put you into some small group dialogues along with a question. And we're going to give you some time to talk to one another and see what you can come up with this question, see what your answer is as you're out there doing that. When you do come back, we are going to ask a few of the groups to report out. So keep track of what it is that you are talking about in your small groups. There's misnomers about fathers, especially African-American fathers. I think people often talk about us as being deadbeat dads, that we're incarcerated, that there are all types of things. But one of the things that I know is that the CDC, in their last report, talks about the involvement of African-American fathers, proves that we're the most involved in our families. In my work at the Department of Corrections in Minnesota, the one thing that held true in the juvenile corrections facilities, everyone there loved their mother, but they wanted to know their father. Even if that father wasn't there, it didn't matter. They all wanted to know, who is my dad? How does that, how are we related? What are the connections that I'm missing? It's not easy being a father to begin with. It's even more difficult when things are thrown up in your way. And the state of Minnesota, it's a woman's state, especially when it comes to fathers and how fathers are treated. You saw a quote earlier. I think I'll just back up to it because I think it's that important. At every turn, an unmarried man who seeks to be a father or just a daddy is rebuffed by a sister that pushes him aside with one hand while reaching into his pocket with the other. Even dads who live with their children and pay a share of the bills are still technically subject to child support in many jurisdictions. And if you think about the systemic part of this, Charles was talking about the vestiges of enslavement. I don't have to go that far back. Those are ones that absolutely have an impact. But I also know that if I just take a look at the welfare system that we have today, fathers are not invited into that system. Every system we have invites fathers to not be a part of their children's lives. It's more of an advantage if the father isn't involved. And we wonder why fathers push back. We want to be as much in that child's life as anyone else. My wife and I were having this conversation on the way here today. And given where we are right now with the state that we're in with COVID, people are totally separate right now. We're just now beginning to try to figure out how to come back online. We have the racial and social injustice issues that have popped up with the continued killing of Black men by law enforcement. And you have that third pandemic that no one ever really talks about, which is trauma itself and the level of trauma that's being inflicted on our young ones as they're trying to come up. We often talk about adverse childhood experiences. That's the pandemic that's been with us forever that no one ever wants to acknowledge. And when you think about the majority of those kids, at least the ones that I see, they all look like me. And so from my perspective, this is a third pandemic that we absolutely have to have a conversation about. And quite frankly, I cannot allow people to not be uncomfortable. When people are uncomfortable, Black folks die. Excuse me, when people are not uncomfortable. When they are very comfortable in their world, Black folks die. And so I want people to be very uncomfortable, which is why I put that trigger warning up at the very beginning. The old world is dying and a new world is struggling to be born. And right now the monsters are running amok. Some of those monsters are diseases. Some of them are the way we treat each other in this world. There are multiple ways that this all applies. Charles and I started having a conversation about the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm gonna ask Charles, we got maybe 2 minutes or so left before we send you off into the rooms. I'm gonna ask Charles to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter and fathers. Charles?
After doing research, I came across the notion that Black Lives Matter means different things to different folks. For example, pregnant woman was just murdered in South Minneapolis. Baby was delivered 4 months prematurely. Domestic violence, shot by the father of the child, and no Black Lives Matter. We need to be clear. What's genuine from the people and what's given to the people. It's not emotional attachment or opinion. Black Lives Matter, political organization with an agenda. I would ask that you research it. Go to the website and look at the history. These questions are relevant and they're also retrospective. You need to think about these things. When you talk about the Black family, when it's only mother and children included in that and man is excluded, that's problematic for my community. When we separate our people and say, Black trans lives matter, Black this lives matter, Black that, no, let's focus on what the root is, because all of those subcategories still face discrimination at higher proportional rates than their white counterparts. So let's not use distractionary tactics to not deal with the issue. Black Lives Matter is a slogan. It's a political agenda. And if Black lives really mattered, why aren't the outcomes showing that? Why is the way we live from day to day not showing that? When you can call the police on me for doing something that's legal, knowing that the police have the potential to kill me when they arrive, to be honest, Black lives really don't matter in the United States and haven't. And if we want to change that reality, we can do that as individuals. We do have power in that. We're not powerless, but I think we need to research on our own and be honest with ourselves with what we uncover.
The piece that you see at the bottom of that slide that talks about white allies and a question mark. I hear this term often. A woman friend of mine named Ariella sent me a link to an article that talks about white allies and through the lens of African Americans. And the outcome that I saw in everything that I read was that people can be allies, but unless you're doing your own work, it's not possible to be an ally. So don't step into the space and claim to be unless you're doing your own work. We didn't create this mess, and it truly isn't ours to clean up, although that's where we seem to find ourselves. But if we're going to be allies, then let's be allies. Let's each do the work that we need to do. Imagine if America's social institutions realigned so that men's parenting efforts were treated as a resource with real potential. That requires a whole different way of thinking, a whole different way of being truly in this world. These are some links to different articles. You will have access to these. You can certainly click on them and find the information that you might want to do. I found this article myself very compelling to think about how do we reframe the conversation. So at this point, we're going to put you into small groups. Don't worry, someone's going to push a button in a few minutes and send you off into Never Never Land. And that question will appear in your chat box. But the initial part, looking at that question, ask the question of where does support, and I want to say specifically for Black fathers, to build their role as caregivers. Where does support for Black fathers to build their role as caregivers come from? Where is that? It has to come from somewhere. So I would ask, you're going to go off when you come back. Again, we'll do some Q&A, and then we will wrap up this section. And I thank you, Charles, for being visible. It's very important from my perspective to be able to see somebody who looks like me in this conversation. I can't see who's in the audience, but I can see who's on my screen. And right now, that would be Charles Dixon. So, brother, I appreciate you being there. Anything you want to say before they send them off, Charles?
We can do something right now. If this was a relay race, our parents and grandparents and forefathers handed us the baton. It's up to us. What are we willing to do with it? What are we going to tell our children we did? It's not a time for paralysis. The guilt and discomfort, whatever the feelings emotionally that you have that's attached to this information, use it as motivation to change outcomes if that's truly something that you disagree with.
In the chat, there are a number of things that have been entered. I see from Jill, the two topics were around Black men in prison and programs needed to help them connected to their families, also mental health issues and much needed support. Guessing from what we observed, yeah, everything moves along. Structural racism puts Blacks as a disadvantage as fathers, corrections, housing, and more. And I realize that the participants probably cannot see all of the comments. And so I believe this is being recorded. If we save the chat itself, I think that can be included as part of the recording and folks will be able to follow up there.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Policies that support Black families, whether married or not, to foster relationships between caregivers and children and caregivers to each other. I think we forget the caregivers to each other piece of this. We keep talking about from caregiver to child, and that really needs to something it needs to be explored with reference to Angela Davis's roots in Birmingham. I know we have 1 minute left if I'm looking at my watch correctly here, Jane. And so there's another piece to that Angela Davis quote. And of course, when your computer freezes, it's the one thing that's absolutely dreaded. So the rest of that quote says, oh, and I'm not even going to try to paraphrase it or actually say it. What she is talking about is that we have the prayer, God grant me the serenity, right, to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Angela Davis simply says, I am no longer accepting those things, that it is time to change. And I absolutely agree with her that we are in a position to make that change now. I think we have a perfect storm where we have the ability to do whatever we really choose to at this point. And so I'm going to turn this back over. Charles, is there anything you want to say before I give it back to Jane?
We're going to move on to the next section in the agenda, but I want to just say a major thank you to both of you for giving us this presentation, and also to know that I think the work we have, and I know I can't see all of you out there, but usually we're a fairly white audience, that the work we have to do is very important in this arena. And we will commit to getting questions from the chat, comments from the chat, whether if we're not sure if this is going to be able to be in the recording, but to all of you who came, we will get something back to you. And we also want you to know that we have from St. Thomas some special assistance so that we will be able to have 2 more webinars on the topic of prenatal to 3 and fathers, and they will be in August and September in between this and our next major forum, which is on October 14th. So please stay tuned, and thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This is an emerging and important conversation, and we need to seize the moment. So with that, we'll move on to Deb Fitzpatrick, who is with the Children's Defense Fund.
I was just gonna say, I'm sorry, 1 second, Deb. If you do have any other questions, you can add them in the Q&A button.
Okay, did you, for people that heard that, add any questions to the Q&A button? And we will follow up.
All right, thanks everybody for being here today. Thank you, Charles. Thanks for that amazing presentation and that amazing exercise. I think it's a really, Dave, sorry, thanks. It's a really important conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in August and September. I just wanted to say, first of all, just in framing, I'm going to really focus today on early care and education, given limited time, and I hope Erin and Tracy will sort of highlight some other areas that are really important to the prenatal to 3 area as well. I wanted to give a special shout out to this group for the important work you've been doing over the last 4 years to build relationships, and I think we did in this last legislative session did kind of capitalize on that work to bring people together, generating over 30,000 contacts to legislators in this area. So I think that we have done a lot to engage folks, and I appreciate everyone who's part of this community who has played a key role in that. I wanted to start with some of the efforts that we were able to advance related to child care assistance. Special shout out and thanks to Representative Pinto, also Senator Housley, Senator Wicklund, Senator Benson, and many others who really worked to prioritize this issue in the final hours of the special legislative session. We were able to come into federal compliance, avoiding a $5.4 million federal penalty in passing reimbursement rates at the 25th percentile of the current market rate survey using federal funds. And we were also able to, again, with the help of many folks on this call and others, move ahead with some of the changes to the licensed family care training for second adult caregivers and substitutes. Those two pieces will bring us into federal compliance, at least temporarily. So I think it's also just important beyond the specifics of the policy to recognize that this is the first increased investment in years in addressing the low provider rates that we have in this program for those important folks all across the state who are caring for our youngest Minnesotans. And also that we made important progress in terms of addressing integrity concerns and really put us in a position to build on these changes in the next year. We know we need to do that, obviously. Also wanted to highlight a couple of changes that were part of the education policy bill. I know this is kind of a little bit outside of the prenatal to 3 arena, but obviously I think also just important pieces. A lot of work done by Cindy Cunningham, Close Gaps by 5, Representative Joachim, Representative Erickson, Solutions Not Suspensions, Legal Aid, and many others to get these changes across the finish line. So again, I think it's just really important to acknowledge the incredible coordination and that happened during this legislative session. So we were able to extend the date by which programs will need to meet 3- and 4-star parent aware ratings in order to receive early learning scholarships. That was really, really important to rural providers in particular, family care providers in particular. It's going to make families, give families more options, and we think that's really a critical change. And then we also were able to move ahead with some important changes to suspensions for children in pre-K programs. We know that this is an important issue for our K-12 system, but it's also a surprisingly important issue within our pre-K and our early learning and care system. So I think those changes were really important advances as well. And then just wanted to acknowledge legislative leadership. Again, Representative Pinto, thank you for your leadership in terms of Minnesota kind of leading the nation in terms of providing emergency grants to keep our childcare system going. Minnesota is one of the few states that invested new state funds in helping childcare during the COVID-19 crisis. Those were really, really important investments. We obviously needed more, but you know, these grants really helped many providers stay open, serving our essential workers and families and children. Finally, also then just wanted to highlight some of the work that in leadership, again, of the governor, lieutenant governor, the children's cabinet, and many in the early childhood care and education advocacy community in terms of making wise use of federal funds that came to Minnesota through the CARES Act. 48 million is going out through a variety of, to providers and families through a variety of mechanisms highlighted here. And then finally, I just wanted to also just lift up the leadership of the governor's office, the children's cabinet, lieutenant governor in using COVID relief funds to support childcare. This is a proposal that is before the Legislative Advisory Council now. We're hoping that we'll get the final approval on this on Monday, which would provide $56.6 million in funding and 3 monthly grants to open childcare providers that are experiencing increased costs during the emergency. And both the last 2 slides, you know, highlight the importance of our relationship with the federal funding as it relates to early care and education in this in the COVID-19 situation. And so I did want to just highlight some of the efforts that are happening at the federal level for folks. As you've probably all heard, you know, efforts are underway right now to negotiate the next COVID relief package at the federal level, you know, with state budgets, you know, in deficits and expecting deficits within our own state budget. These federal funds are more and more and more important. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is bipartisan support at the federal level for including childcare in that next package. Including Senator Joni Ernst in our bordering Iowa, who has taken the leadership role in really advancing this. And Senator McConnell has said that children will be one of the priorities for the next package. So I just wanted to highlight this because I think it is important for this community to stay engaged and continue to urge our federal delegation to include early care and learning and prenatal to 3 supports within that next package. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to, I don't know who's going first, Aaron or Tracy, and we'll be here for questions later.
Aaron is up next. Thank you, Deb.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to see if I can take control on my slides here. Deb, it's great to hear your comments. I think she covered much of what I would say. So I appreciate her. Let's see if I can get this up here. There we go. Can you all see that? I made it. Thank you. Great. So an honor to be here with you all. I just wanted to kind of quickly touch on kind of a variety of components that we've talked about related to the Children's Cabinet in earlier prenatal and 3 sessions. And some of that, as you can imagine, as all of our worlds turned upside down as COVID started, has taken various iterations and forms. But we are at a place where we are really taking a deep breath and trudging forward on both these short-term and long-term strategies to really advance and center children and families in the work of the administration and across the state. And so I've talked to you at previous meetings sort of about these priority areas that they're working on in the Children's Cabinet. Those are listed on the left here, and we have a variety of cross-agency efforts, both administrative actions and beginning kind of a variety of efforts with agency leaders and community members, young people, to devise sort of what are those administrative strategies, what are policy recommendations in these areas, what would aligned data and money look like in these priority areas. And I just kind of remind you all too that these we really try to stay centered in these action teams, as we call, in sort of the feedback loops that we're having with community about priorities. There are things maybe that aren't visible here that we're also trying to ensure. We've obviously, food security has been a big priority in Minnesota and for children and families for a very long time. It was something that we've heard a lot about in our engagement efforts. And it's something that during COVID, there has been an added attention and need around, especially I think when I think about little ones, prenatal to 3. And so thinking really about when we talk about healthy beginnings, how does that food security component tie into that? So just kind of some examples. And I would say in a variety of these, so children's mental health is a space where from the very beginning of COVID, we knew there was a need for cross-agency action. We knew there was a need for, well, agencies might be very good at sending out updates around sort of flexibilities that are coming. It might not be in sort of a layperson's term or a provider term to say, okay, what's the totality of what we're saying to this community and what we're asking for? And so we've done things like a letter across agency that kind of summarized, okay, here are all the pieces that have happened across the enterprise related to children's mental health. Here's what folks can expect from the state. That's just kind of an example. And I would say on the front of kind of convening these cross agencies and forging these relationships and conversations, we're back to jumpstarting that work now. So it's some of them have continued in more robust ways. I'll talk obviously about the child care and early education piece. Others have sort of had to take different forms during COVID. But I would say a huge shout out to my friends across state agencies that there's a real hunger and desire to kind of pause the emergency work of, no, I shouldn't say pause the work of emergency, but make sure that we're not losing sight of the ongoing work as we're responding to an emergency every single day. And I think the passion and focus on equity that we're hearing from our agency partners and that desire to continue building that muscle is what a Children's Cabinet is supposed to do, coordinating state agencies in that way. And I think that's really exciting, and we're grateful for that push. We're also getting to a place where we've collected most of the information around the children's fiscal map. So this is an effort. Minnesota has gone through this at a pretty high level a couple years ago, but many states, local municipalities have gone through an effort where it's sort of the analysis of what is all the spending on the children. The federal government actually does this quite a bit. Most of my career, I've worked in Indian country. There's a snapshot of what the feds spend on Indian country each year across all of the state agencies. That's sort of the vision of what we're trying to create here. And so we're kind of excited about that. I would say what we think about this first year is more of an information and a baseline. Really, our vision of what we're trying to create is a tool for all of you, frankly, to be able to say, okay, here's where we're starting from, and we want as much information. We want the state to own the data analysis and the compilation of information, so that you all have a tool to push for additional resources and to be able to clearly say, here's what we've seen before and how do we push that forward. We're also really digging in and advancing the work around sort of a children's budget in 2021. So thinking about what's the totality of all the recommendations that are coming from agencies, and how do we ensure that we're talking about that and talking about that, and how do we just also create space for folks to come together, and rather than think about, okay, agency proposals come up through a process at a particular agency, how do we create the space to build those recommendations together, sort of agnostic of agency walls, and then kind of figure out where it needs to plant and who needs to own it. And then I would also say our engagement, our advisory council has been incredibly rich right now. We've had lots of sort of subgroups happening, and we're doing kind of monthly virtual convenings, and that's just been really helpful for us to have a feedback loop and learning of what folks are hearing on the ground in terms of priorities. I talked last time about the Education and Childcare Work Group. I'll just touch on it briefly again. This is a COVID response work group, so we report directly to the governor and lieutenant governor and first lady 3 times a week on this work. It's co-chaired by me and Deputy Commissioner Heather Mueller at MDE. Our work has included everything from like building supply chains for hand sanitizer to getting specific ordering for providers to get milk, to creating the CRF proposal that Deb talked about, and I'll talk about a little bit. Again, obviously lots of work right now, more on kind of thinking about fall and the fall guidance for older students, but much of sort of my piece and the team kind of dug in on the childcare side has been that specific lens and sort of every decision that is being talked about, whether it's opening of new sectors or supply needs. We've had a really robust partnership with Think Small and with the procurement work group to get supplies that we know from childcare providers. So surveys out to providers to know what they need, and then get those supplies out. So a lot of work right now is there's more discussion around kind of masking or face guidance. We're doing a lot of work on face shields. How do we make sure that we've got face shields where those clear coverings to protect both the wearer and the kid, but also really consideration around early childhood development and seeing faces, and how do we procure and get those supplies to the hands of providers. So I won't read through all this slide there, but this is just kind of a listing of regular outreach that our group is doing with various groups. I'm not going to go through it, but one piece I would highlight is we've been trying really hard to either weekly or biweekly send out an email to the 7,000 childcare providers in the state for which we have email addresses, and then also sharing that out with advocates. And I really appreciate the many folks here who have helped kind of push that out widely. And then we were doing bi-weekly calls really focused on public health guidance. We moved those to monthly over the summer because providers have asked us to. They don't want to hang out with us at 7 p.m. during a summer evening. So moving those, the next one is on Monday. I would continue to love help sharing those. It's a great forum for folks to hear directly from DEED about financial support, from MDH about specific guidance. One of the things we're going to be focusing on Monday is around consistent groupings and sort of really the safety that we're seeing when providers are not intermixing staff and are trying to keep consistent groupings of young people. It's an extremely helpful tool in preventing the spread of COVID, and we're seeing a lot more evidence across the state of it working really clearly. And so want to kind of provide some specific examples on that. I won't go through this in detail, but these are the themes that we've been hearing from providers. So obviously financial strain and need for immediate support. Many providers are serving essential worker families. So we know essential workers in that sort of definition is 82% of the economy. So it shouldn't surprise us that it's the majority. We also know through our data analysis, we know we've got about 135,000 kids who are in a family where all available parents are working in a tier 1 or tier 2 essential workers. So these are people who have probably been at work the entire time, are in positions that might have a much harder time teleworking. That's a pretty significant number of children where one, they're in a single parent or guardian household that's working in that field, or both parents are. And so that's kind of really when we think about like an absolute crisis need of licensed childcare, we know for those folks, obviously not all of them would take licensed care, but that's kind of a number that we think about across the state. Deb talked about the grants, and I think well said in terms of additional resources needed in the peacetime emergency grants. The administration advanced $10 million into the third round, which allowed us to cover about 2/3 of those applicants in the third round. And huge thanks to the legislature for passing the that package. I would say really at the phase where when we were at that was really focused on kind of a different number of 38,000 essential workers, and ensuring when all businesses are shut down that we could support those providers. And so when we talk about the CRF in a second here, it's really kind of a pivot in strategy as businesses are opening back up and we're thinking about these challenges. Obviously, I'm sure so many of you have heard about this. I mean, just the trauma and stress on families right now in terms of folks trying to work, everything sort of bleeding together, working, home, kids, where can your children go, what's safe, and the additional stress specifically on our families in lower income households. And so really trying to center what those interventions look like. And I'm sure many of you have seen, but as we think about kind of prenatal 3, just a ton of national research right now around the disproportionate impact on women that we're seeing as in these childcare challenges, and folks kind of going back to work. And some of the numbers are just really staggering. And so I think when we think about birth outcomes and young children and parent bonding, there's just a lot there to keep us up at night and a lot of work to do. I touched briefly on just a few accomplishments. We talked about the peacetime emergency grants and some of this outreach. A huge shout out to my friends at DHS and MDE who have just created significant flexibility around licensing, childcare assistance, parent aware ratings, early learning scholarships, and there's lots of dialogue between those, which is really across those agencies, which has really been helpful. Deb went through many of these portions, and Chair Pinto is telling me to get moving here. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the heroic efforts of providers who have been answering the call to stay open, sticking with us, staying in touch. I was going to kind of talk about what we're seeing related to guidance and cost directly to providers. And we can talk about that more at another time, but that really kind of came into our CRF request and a lot of research into the costs that we're seeing in terms of exclusion guidance, cleaning needs, and other supports that we know providers are needing, childcare providers, in order to help support our children and families. But I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Erin, thank you so much. You have, I just want to echo, I'm sure what many of us have said, is that the Children's Cabinet and your team across the state have just been awesome. And there's so much more for you to say. So we'll have you back, and we'll also have some time for Q&A. So without further ado, Tracy Roloff from the Department of Human Services is up with the Preschool Development Grant, and then we will have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So thank you.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Tracy Roloff. I'm a Special Projects Manager in the Child Care Services Division at Department of Human Services. I'm here today to talk to you about the Preschool Development Grant that Minnesota has. I'm standing in for Amanda Varley, the Preschool Development Grant Project Manager, who is out on maternity leave for about another month now. So it's good to see everybody. I do have my 4-year-old home with me today, and so you might hear in the background. So we're doing that thing. Just to start off, I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I wanted to start off by thanking Dave and Charles for the start of this meeting and grounding us in what they talked about. I think it's really important. And thanks to Elders for Infant, Representative Pinto, and for all those who have shared information today. I really want to tie back to one of the things that Assistant Commissioner Bailey talked about in terms of our focus on racial equity and anti-racism and the work we're doing in state departments. And I would say this preschool development grant from the beginning has been our state across the 3 agencies of education, health, and human services across agency in combination with the Children's Cabinet are wanting to focus on systems building with a racial equity and anti-racism lens. And so this first slide that I'm sharing, the kind of guiding principles that go around the circle, really the ways in which wanting to embed racial equity and trauma-informed practice into all of our work that we're doing. So I'll give you a little bit of an update on some of the projects that are funded through this preschool development grant, federal grant that we received, and want to start that with a top level that we're working to ensure that we're taking approaches that advance racial equity, that focus on naming and uncovering our implicit biases and work towards trauma-informed care in this work. And so to start, one of the main investments of resources through preschool development grant is in the Help Me Connect system, which is really meant to be a web-based user interface for families to know what is happening, what resources and supports are available through the state, find out information on them, and then figure out how to be connected. So I'm not going to read through every single update in these slides. I trust they'll be shared with folks in attendance, but there's a little bit too much information to do justice to it speaking today. And Help Me Connect is really going to be shared through a process. The state is investing some of the federal funds through preschool development grant in what are being called implementation hubs. We're hoping to release an RFP to distribute these funds on July 20th, so that'll be really soon. We're hoping to fund up to 10 hub locations, and these are meant to be both physical brick and mortar, virtual hubs, or mobile hubs, or some combination, recognizing the limitations that we have from our pandemic, but also that in parts of greater Minnesota, that physical locations often don't work for folks who have to travel long distances to receive services. And so the idea is to invest in these implementation hubs, which are meant to be focused on relationship-based, so that human-based, person-centered navigation that's absolutely essential for folks to know what services are available, to understand them, and then apply for them. And so the implementation hubs are kind of the wraparound around this Help Me Connect system that will be coupled with Bridge to Benefits to help Minnesota families understand what services are out there, get connected to them, and do that all in this way that's based in culturally appropriate, relationship-based, human navigation to support our families in a good way. The preschool development grant is also focused on the workforce. Erin, particularly in her talking points, talked about the incredible challenges that our early care and education field is facing right now. And preschool development grant is investing some funds. Really, I think when Erin's talking points, she talked about the incredible risk that child care providers are putting themselves at right now, and the stress and supporting. And it's been an ongoing conversation even before the pandemic started about how we need to support those caring for our youngest children in a really strong way. And so preschool development grant is continuing to invest in that. For Community Solutions Fund, this is a targeted partnership with a program run through the Department of Health. The preschool development grant has invested funds in their Community Solutions Fund, which is providing grants to 23 community-based organizations focused on prioritizing organizations that are led by people of color and American Indians that have a focus on addressing issues in the community for children aged prenatal to 3. And so this work, the Community Solutions Fund just finalized the grant agreements. And so through the links listed on this slide, you can see the organizations that were funded. It's a really exciting group of organizations, and Preschool Development Grant is partnering both to supply the funding to these organizations and learn from the work being done in community what practice, program, and policy changes might be needed to sustain this kind of work going forward. through, there's also an investment in early childhood mental health consultation, and we know right now that mental health is just a primary focus across the board for every single person, and particularly for those groups that are serving our families through early childhood settings. And so there is some investment in money to expand early childhood mental health consultation generally, and then a specific focus to family, friend, and neighbor providers. So that is kind of the updates here, is just a real investment in the mental health needs of children, families, and providers at this time. We're also doing some really, really strong work behind the scenes on our data systems and how they talk to each other, so that families experience less burden, less confusion, less challenge as they're trying to interact with and receive state services, that we're not putting the burden on families to figure out all the disjointed ways in which our services need to talk to each other better. And so we're doing that through looking at eligibility options for interested families and how we can align those more strongly, ensuring that we're doing appropriate data sharing practices behind the scenes, so we're not having to ask families for the same information multiple times. And we're looking back at existing projects and working with some really cutting edge, innovative work that's happening nationally through our partners with Code for America, through the Department of Human Services, to ensure that we're taking a real person-centered lens to designing processes that support families so that they're not experiencing a convoluted, disjointed system. We're also excited to announce that the Preschool Development Grant, as a part of the project management team, has hired a grant tribal lead, Lucy Little-Wolf Arias, who sits at the Department of Education. And she has been focusing on compiling the information, qualitative and quantitative, from the Preschool Development Grant needs assessment that was completed last year, and doing a specific update on American Indian needs, and sharing that both with tribal leadership as well as state leadership to inform ongoing work. In addition, she's focusing on creating a platform for Indigenous evaluation to guide the work, and really building and strengthening community outreach and engagement to tribally led early childhood programs. And then the next newest development is that we're releasing an RFP for an evaluator to evaluate the work with the Preschool Development Grant. The link is here. It looks like the RFP will close on July 27th. It opened on July 6th, and questions are due by Monday, July 13th. So if you're interested, you can definitely follow up with me, follow that link, but we're looking to bring on partners to evaluate our work on Preschool Development Grant. And that is what I have for today, so thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Very good, thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for questions and answers. There are some Q&A from the chats and that have been answered. I'll just mention that we just want, one of them was, will Children's Cabinet prioritize greater support for prenatal to 3 from one of our elders? And Erin answers, this has been and will continue to be a priority in a number of ways. So I think that's important. But if you have a question and you want to put something up in the Q&A, we can take a look at that. And if other panelists want to jump in with comments or questions before, we will wrap up at 10:25.
So Jane, there's one question that was in the chat. It was a question about suspension, about the suspension. It said, I was wondering which program specifically does that suspension will affect. Is it school-based pre-K, ECFE, school-based childcare, licensed and home childcare, or all of the above? I think that's for Deb.
Could you hear that, Deb?
Yes, and I might have to do some research on that. There may be somebody else on the call that has more. I do believe it's pre-K programs, but I don't want to say for sure until I check in on that, but there may be others on the call who have worked more closely on this particular piece. They could put an answer in the chat. Otherwise, I'll get back to you with an answer to that one.
All right, and then we have a question from Melissa. I'd like to hear more about, from Aaron, about the costs associated with guidance, especially with regard to the 10-person limit per group. Is that something you want to take?
Yeah, I can. So we've done a lot of research on this particular issue and topic. I would say this is where I would really encourage partners and providers who have stories and information to share. I think one of the themes that we're learning across the country is that there's not sort of a source of truth. This is where there's not a playbook for a pandemic. And so we're in constant dialogue. Deb talked a bit about the federal work. I would just say a huge shout out to Senator Smith, and I would highly recommend that you have her, someone from her staff at a future meeting. Her team has been digging in some incredibly meaningful ways and getting information and developing solutions on this. So just specifically what we're seeing is related to family child care, potential costs of about $1,200 a month, $1,000 to $1,200. And then in centers that guidance is keeping those limits can cost anywhere from $15,000 to $18,000 a month. That doesn't factor in cleaning costs and kind of all these other pieces. So that's a really astronomical number. I think some of those predictions are, if any of you saw Class report nationally about a $9.6 billion shortfall in childcare per month. So I can't understate what Deb said about federal intervention here. I mean, states have to balance their budget, and so I think we're really pushing and advocating and trying to forge a way nationally to make some investments. And other states, frankly, are calling us every day trying to figure out how to mimic some of the pieces that we've done. But I think we need more intervention on a federal level, and that consistent dialogue with our federal delegation from all of you and from us is just critically important, and sharing those stories. Like I said, I just can't understate that enough, that there's partners at the Federal Reserve and NACI and others who have created these incredible surveys that use that information, and that's sort of what we're running with right now. And stories and feedback that we're getting directly from providers. And my team gets close to probably 100 emails a day directly from providers with information that we're using to design these strategies.
Our next question, we had kind of two people talking about the Mental Health Coalition, and they wanted to know just more information about it, as well as, is there additional funding available for Early Childhood Mental Health Coalition through the Preschool Development Grant?
So yeah, at the current time, there's about $145,000 a year that's dedicated specifically to early childhood mental health consultation through the Preschool Development Grant. And what I would say is that there is some flexibility in budgeting for us to continue to reassess going forward that need, and whether we need to shift some funding around to better support that going forward. And I think we're learning a lot right now to inform that decision.
Very good.
I would just add, separate from the PDG, I was going to talk about just shortly kind of the governor's gear dollars that went to MDE, and there's a set of resources that MDE set aside for 0 to 8 wraparound supports for families, and mental health and well-being is specifically called out in that. Really, I think what we've heard in community engagement is that need for those wraparound supports with our littlest kids, and those organizations that are providing those supports really providing meaningful. So I think that piece is also something that we're thinking about from that angle as well.
Great. Well, I'm going to have to call our Q&A over and turn it over to Representative Pinto for a final word, and we will be processing all of this and get back to you all with, as best we can, some of the answers you've raised, questions you've raised, and try to get answers to.
And let's see if I can, bring it up. So Dave Pinto here, and I just want to say thanks to everybody, especially our amazing presenters. And I want to emphasize that what Dave and Charles presented, and thank you to them, is intended to be the first in a series, certainly with sessions in August and September. This is such a critical process of work about racism in prenatal to 3. And so just emphasize that that's going to be, this is just sort of a taste of that in between the regular quarterly sessions that we do. And then thanks to our terrific state team and presenting in the last little bit here about what's been going on. The University of St. Thomas, to emphasize the School of Education, School of Social Work, are our co-hosts in this work, and of course, Elders for Infants. And it has been amazing doing this for the past 4 years. And I want to emphasize, as Jane said at the beginning, we've really had the 3 goals of sharing plans, building a base of knowledge, and then establishing relationships. And it's hard to get those relationships going in this kind of Zoom setting. That's part of the reason for the breakout sessions. I'm going to continue trying to think about that. But hopefully you've had the sense this past 90 minutes of continuing to lay your base of knowledge, as I know that I have too. So many thanks to everybody, and we'll be sending information out, but the next policy forum will be October 14th in the morning. That's a Wednesday. And then again, keep your eyes peeled for those events in August and September as well. So Jane and everybody, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Stay well, everyone.